ever think about, you know how, like, everything's connected in the world? I mean, like, all the countries. There's this whole system, like a set of rules that most countries actually follow. Like, today, we're going to look into that. We're diving into international law.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
And we've got,
It's a lot like
yeah, a bunch of sources.
a global operating system for international relations.
Yeah.
So you can think about international law as like the rule book
Yeah.
for how states and other international actors interact. Like, what are the standards? What are the obligations that they have to each other? And it covers things like diplomatic relations and how states treat their own people within their own borders. And it also covers things like trade and the environment.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because things are getting blurry now with the internet and all this stuff with, like, the public international law, like, between states. And then you've got the private international law, which is, like, between companies and individuals across borders. So where do we even begin? Like, where does international law even come from?
Well, there's this really important document. It's called Article 38.1 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, or ICJ.
Okay.
And this is kind of like the list.
So this is like the source.
The source documents for international law. And so the first thing on the list is treaties.
Okay.
And treaties are basically legally binding agreements between states.
So they're like contracts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They could be bilateral, so between two states.
Yeah.
Or they can be multilateral between like
A whole bunch.
of states.
Like the UN.
Exactly. Like the UN Charter is a treaty.
Okay.
And then there's also like the Vienna Convention on the law of treaties, which tells you how to make a treaty and how to interpret a treaty. And so states consent to treaties through things like signature and ratification. And the UN plays a really important role in helping states make treaties.
So it's like a global contract negotiation?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got these big treaties. What else? What are some of the other sources?
So another important source is customary international law.
Customary?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So this one's a little tricky. It's not written down in one place.
Oh.
But it's basically based on how states consistently act.
Okay.
And the belief that they have to act that way. And so there's this Latin term, opinio juris.
Opinio juris.
Which means...
That's very fancy.
It does sound fancy. It means a sense of legal obligation that states have. And so you could see evidence of customary international law in treaties themselves. Or in court decisions. Or in national laws, diplomatic correspondence. All these different things show how states act and what they believe they're legally required to do. And what's really interesting about customary international law is that it's binding on all states.
Even if they've never?
Even if they've never written it down.
Signed a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's like this unwritten law. And a good example of that is the prohibition against genocide. That was customary international law before it was actually written down in the Genocide Convention.
So it's almost like consistent global behavior becomes law.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. What else is there?
So then there's general principles of law.
General principles?
Yes.
What's that?
So these are principles that are common to most legal systems around the world. So things like good faith. The idea that you shouldn't be tried for the same crime twice was called res judicata.
Res judicata.
Yeah. And then impartiality of judges. So these are just basic ideas of fairness and justice that courts use when treaties and custom are silent on a particular issue. So it's like a gap filler.
So it's kind of like, okay, well, we don't have a specific treaty, but this is the general principle that makes sense in this situation.
Exactly. And then finally, there are what are called subsidiary means for determining international law.
Subsidiary.
Yeah. And these are basically things like judicial decisions and scholarly writings. So
like what the courts have said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What courts have said, both national and international courts.
Yeah.
How they've interpreted the law.
Yeah.
And then scholarly writings, which are basically experts writing about the law.
Yeah. Okay. So those are kind of like the supporting documents.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we know where it comes from, like, what are the big things? What are the big buckets that international law covers?
So there are a bunch of different areas of international law.
Yeah.
One is international human rights law.
Human rights. Okay.
Yeah. And this is all about how states treat their own people.
Okay.
Even in times of peace. And there are a bunch of important documents in this area.
Okay.
So you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR.
Okay.
And then you have the two international covenants. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, social and cultural rights, ICESCR.
Okay, so those are all about like the rights that people have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And together, they make up what's called the International Bill of Human Rights.
Wow. Okay, so that's like the Constitution of Human Rights.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that's in times of peace. What about in times of war?
So that's where international humanitarian law comes in.
International humanitarian law.
Yeah, also known as the Law of Armed Conflict, or IHL.
IHL.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is all about limiting the effects of armed conflict and protecting people who aren't fighting.
Okay.
And so the main sources here are the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols.
Okay.
And some important customary international law. And some of the main principles of international humanitarian law are things like distinguishing between combatants and civilians.
Okay.
And the prohibition against attacking people who are no longer fighting, like if they're wounded or they've surrendered.
Okay.
And then just avoiding unnecessary suffering.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about like holding individuals accountable for war crimes and things like that?
Right, so that's international criminal law.
International criminal law.
Or ICL.
ICL, okay.
And this is all about punishing individuals for international crimes like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression.
So these are like the most serious crimes.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the International Criminal Court, or ICC,
Yeah.
plays a major role in enforcing international criminal law.
Okay. So we've got human rights, humanitarian law, criminal law. What about like the world of business?
Yeah, so international trade law is all about the rules for trade between states.
Okay.
There's a bunch of different aspects of international trade law, both public and private.
Okay.
So public international trade law is all about state-to-state trade relations.
Yeah.
And then private international trade law is all about trade between private companies across borders.
Okay.
And a really important organization in this area is the World Trade Organization, or WTO.
The WTO, yeah.
It deals with trade policy and trade disputes.
Okay.
And then there's another organization called UNCITRAL, which works to harmonize international trade law to make it easier for companies to trade across borders.
Cool. So then what about the oceans?
So for the oceans, we've got the law of the sea.
Law of the sea, yeah.
And the most important legal instrument in this area is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS.
UNCLOS.
And this convention lays out all the rules for maritime zones.
Okay.
So things like internal waters, the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, the continental shelf.
Wow.
All those different zones.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
It also covers things like navigation rights, resource management, environmental protection, marine scientific research, and dispute settlement.
That's a lot. Okay, so like, how does any of this stuff actually get enforced? Like, there's no international police force or anything, right?
Well, you're right. Yeah. Enforcement is one of the biggest challenges in international law.
Yeah.
Because unlike domestic law, there's no global police force to make states comply with their obligations.
So how does it work?
So it's really a decentralized system.
Okay.
Based on state consent.
Okay.
So states have to agree to be bound by international law.
Yeah.
And then they often incorporate international law into their own domestic legal systems.
Okay.
So that it can be enforced by their own courts.
So it's almost like they're choosing to make it real.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there are also international courts like the ICJ, which deals with disputes between states, and the ICC, which deals with international crimes.
Right.
But those courts can only hear cases if the states involved have agreed to their jurisdiction.
Okay.
So their power is limited.
Yeah.
And then there's also this idea of state responsibility.
State responsibility.
Yeah, which means if a state violates international law, it has a responsibility to stop that violation and make reparations for any harm that it's caused.
Okay.
And states can also use diplomatic measures like negotiation to try to resolve disputes.
Okay.
And then in some cases, the UN Security Council can impose sanctions on states that are violating international law.
Okay.
But again, all those mechanisms are limited by state sovereignty and the influence of powerful states.
So it's kind of like, you know, the rules are there, but it's a little harder to enforce them than it is like with laws in your own country.
Exactly.
Okay, so like why even bother? Like if it's so hard to enforce, why do we even have international law?
Well, despite all the challenges, international law is still really important.
Okay.
Because it helps to maintain some semblance of order and security in the world.
Okay.
It promotes respect for state sovereignty. It discourages the use of force.
Wow.
It promotes international cooperation on things like trade, the environment, human rights.
Yeah.
And it helps us to address global challenges like climate change, terrorism, pandemics.
So basically, it's like we need these rules even if they're not perfect.
Exactly.
Okay.
And even though there are some limitations,
yeah,
it's still a really important tool for making the world a better place.
But it's still not perfect.
No, it's definitely not perfect.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest challenges is that it can sometimes reflect the interests of powerful states.
Yeah, that makes sense.
More than the interests of weaker states.
Yeah.
And there's also the challenge of getting states to actually obey the rules.
Yeah.
And then just the whole issue of state sovereignty.
Yeah.
States are reluctant to give up their sovereignty to international institutions.
So it's a tricky thing.
It's really tricky.
Yeah. It's crazy how, like, this whole web of laws is kind of running in the background of our lives all the time. Like we were talking about mail delivery and, like, trade standards. We don't even think about it. But international law is kind of making all that happen.
Yeah, exactly.
So as we wrap up here, like, what do you think are the biggest things that need to change with international law to make it better?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of areas where international law could be improved.
Yeah.
But if I had to choose a few, I would say we need to do more to protect human rights, especially in the face of new challenges like climate change and artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
We need to find better ways to enforce international law and hold states accountable when they break the rules.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that international law is more inclusive and representative of the interests of all states, not just the powerful ones.
So it's really about, like, making sure that the rules are fair and that everybody's following them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really interesting deep dive. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Keep thinking about those big questions, because international law affects all of us, even if we don't always realize it.